Hey, and welcome everyone to Video Chess Training. This is my YouTube channel and I'm International Master William Paschall. Today we're going to be looking at another game from the Aeroflot Open 2016, one of the world's strongest quote-unquote open tournaments. Although technically in the top section it's not really an open, you have to be over 2,500 FIDE to just play in it. Unless there's some special exception for perhaps some very talented junior players. So today's game is Moiseenko, a very strong Grandmaster from Ukraine, playing white, and the young Grandmaster Antipov, who's about 20 years old, playing black. And I never had seen any games by Antipov, but the following game I thought was very creative and very instructive. This is a player who's facing a stronger player, the stronger player playing white, and it's a Bogo-Indian, which is part of my repertoire, and I think a very solid opening for black to play against d4. Moiseenko is an uncompromising player, as I've seen from other games here in the Aeroflot Open. He's basically playing to win or lose every game. d4, very aggressive, not so much in the early stage of the opening, but is in general, Moiseenko is a risk-all kind of player. d4, knight f6, c4, and then e6 from black, and knight f3, not to allow the Bogo-Indian. We have bishop b4 check, going into the Bogo-Indian defense, named after Bogo-Indian. So bishop to b4 check, and the most common move for white is bishop d2. But it's not clear that bishop d2 is better than knight on b to d2. These moves are very, very different. And I think that play after bishop d2 is a little easier in a way, because many times we're talking about trading a piece that's equivalent to the other, bishop for bishop. It doesn't create imbalance in the position. But when white plays knight on b to d2, I think strategically this variation is more difficult for both sides, because in many cases we're confronted with situations where we have to learn how to kind of compare different sorts of advantages. And this is what really makes a chess player strong. He who can decide which principle is more important in a certain kind of position. So imbalance is really the place to go if you want to decisively beat a weaker opponent. Knight on b to d2, and now castles. There are many moves for black here. a5, b6, c5, d5, castles. All these moves are reasonable. Black castles here. b6 is probably the main line for black. So castles and king priority here, immediately setting the precedent. Not maybe the most common variation for black, but certainly one of the lines. Usually black follows up by b6 in this kind of system. After a3, the most common continuation would be bishop takes, d2 check, and b6. But here black keeps the bishop with bishop e7. And this is interesting. It looks very passive on the surface for black to just simply play bishop b4 and then retreat the bishop back to e7. Allowing white basically control the center, allowing white to play e4 very aggressively. But black has a certain solidity, and he can play a structure based on putting his pawns on the dark squares. And in this position, after e4, which is the most aggressive move, white can also play e3. And this is very solid for white. I think e3, black can play, for example, a creative approach here. He doesn't have to play the traditional d5, b6. An interesting idea I found was c5. Perhaps this was Antipov's plan, to play c5 and to try to get into, well, maybe fianchettoing later, maybe creating a kind of semi-towerish or Queen's Indian type of position later. But the knight on d2 is not really well placed for white. And we could exchange on d4 and play d5, perhaps fianchetto at some point. Black has a lot of options. What looked like the critical move is very interesting. D takes c. This is just analysis. There have been some games played here. When black doesn't play like in a Queen's Gambit accepted, black can instead play a5 with the idea of playing knight a6 and knight takes c5. I saw one game, a Grandmaster game, that went something like b3, knight a6, bishop to b2, and knight takes c5. When I think that this knight capture on c5 is more dynamic than the typical plan of bishop takes e7. which kind of gains time for white. So this followed by b6 is one interesting way that black could possibly play, but white remains very solid. e3 is a very, very reasonable choice for white. He doesn't have to play, as in the game, the aggressive move e4. Sometimes in chess, certain players, even very strong ones, can be kind of induced into overreaching themselves. And knowing which players you can do this to and if it can possibly work is very important. Moiseenko seems like a great player, but he also seems like the kind of player who has a tendency to overreach himself at times. So this is the kind of player, black's almost like bullfighting. He sort of plays this whole game like he's kind of trying to induce white to kind of go beyond his means, basically. And I think that's kind of what happened. e4, and then it looks passive, but d6. And I also saw another game in Aeroflot Open. We don't have time to go over two games, but I saw another game where Grandmaster Bogo-Indian played a similar line with black as well. Maybe there's a little bit of a trend going on. Now, it looks like the most aggressive move here is bishop d3 for white. But Moiseenko understands that. It's just that in the structure that looks a little bit like a King's Indian, you think that sometimes the bishop is better on e2 so as not to be obstructed by the pawn on e4, and maybe to control the diagonal d1, h5. Looking at my chess database, I found out that bishop d3 is more common than bishop e2, but looking at the structure, I think that Moiseenko's choice is reasonable. Bishop e2. The bishop is a bit more active on the diagonal d1, h5. But having said that, I think that the bishop d3 is perfectly okay as well. And now, we're basically kind of leaving opening theory behind here. I mean, there just aren't very many games that have reached this position. White played bishop d3 in the vast majority, and black is basically kind of waiting for an opportunity to play here e5 to try to set up a dark square pawn structure. You could experiment with the move c5 for black. This looks like an interesting try. Maybe one or two games have ever been played in this position, but another way to try to establish some control in the center, though I'm not sure after c5 d5 this would be a really very good Benoni for black. I'm not really sure it looks too convincing, so we'll reserve our right to not play that. a5 is a good waiting move, threatening to fix the pawns with a4, and black is waiting for his chance to play e5 in the right moment. Look how he times this. White plays an interesting move. I would expect b3, but Moiseenko played queen c2, and then knight to c6, and now only when white plays b3, he's getting worried about a4 fixing his pawn on a3. Only when white plays b3, we start to look for weaknesses in the white position. This seems like it was prepared by Antipov, but it's a very rare position. Knight h5 now, kind of probing the possibility of putting the knight on f4. Again, a position where almost no games have ever been played. It's a completely original position, but Antipov kind of playing in King's Indian style, looking for the f4 square for his knight, trying to induce white to make some weaknesses. And instead of playing the possible move g3, black's maybe going to play e5 here in the near future. He also has ideas maybe as bishop f6, knight h5, bishop b2, and then knight f4. And Moiseenko goes back with bishop f1. And clearly white has lost time here. But a strong player realizes that the knight on f4 is not really well placed. So this again, kind of King's Indian type of position where, although black isn't fianchettoed as in the King's Indian, the pawn structure is similar. Some things happen like this in the King's Indian where the knight goes to f4 too early, like in variations where white plays Makaganov with h3, and sometimes the knight gets in there on f4 and it can be ousted with g3 profitably for white. So that could be the case here. Now, very interesting position for black here, e5. This was, I think, very well calculated. I looked at this. It is a pawn sacrifice, but it looks like a very well positionally based pawn sacrifice. Because if Moiseenko takes this, d takes e, d takes e, he starts to get, black does start to get a very good grip on the d4 square. So we take the pawn on e5, and now the idea for black is to play knight to d4. And you can follow knight to d4 up with c5. For example, queen c3, which looks like the obvious move here, c5. And it's a long-term pawn sacrifice for black. There's some danger that white's king is still in the center. This is really the most important feature of this whole opening, this whole game, and this whole position, is the fact that black castled on move 4. He put king safety like number 1 in priorities in this game, and it really pays off for him. After this pawn sacrifice, it looks like the white king is in a doubtful position, and black doesn't need to get the material back necessarily. He has chances along the e file, maybe bishop f6 tactically. The knights are very, very active. And after c5, if you played, for example, g3, we can simply retreat the knight back to e6. Black has very, very good control of the d4 square, and I think without a doubt full compensation for the sacrificed material. So I think that this is totally playable for black. And Moiseenko didn't want any part in this, so he played instead d5, closing the position. And I would imagine in the event of g3, for example, black could simply play the strong point type of setup with knight to g6, or play more aggressively with knight h3. Everything will have to be calculated, but knight h3 would put a lot of pressure on the white position, I think. So d5, and then knight to b8, there's no way to go forward. So it's kind of a typical structure now for a kind of closed Bogo-Indian. Not unusual, this kind of position in lines where black plays knight c6, and it reminds me a little bit of a Nimzo-Indian classical variation where black plays the variation with knight c6 and d6, but of course in that kind of position there would be no bishop on the board on e7. So it's a very unusual position. All the pieces are on the board. The structure looks a little like a Nimzo, but it's interesting. White has a spatial advantage with d5, but his development is way behind. He's opened up the position significantly with a lot of pawn moves, so that, I mean, castling queenside, although it's an option, looks kind of risky. Now, this is where Moiseenko, he got really aggressive. Like I said, it's a little like he was the bull in a bullfight. He was kind of goaded into this. I don't know. G3 looks like knight h3. G3 looks like the normal positional move, but I think he rejected it because knight h3, and you don't want to give up your white squared bishop, but at the same time, it makes it very hard for white to develop at all here. So, not liking g3 as an option, Moiseenko didn't really know what to do. He could castle queenside. It would be risky, but at least like a concrete plan. Instead, he played h4, which I think is reasonable. And many times this knight in f4 could be pushed around by g3 and h5 and whatnot. I thought that Antipov played well here. I mean, the normal move for black in this position is quite playable. f5. This pawn break with f5. But I think that the situation would be such that Moiseenko would have reacted to this normal move pretty well. It's kind of a standard plan. White plays g3. Black will probably move away. And then if you take on f5, we take with the bishop. Moiseenko plays bishop d3. And every strong Grandmaster understands the importance of the e4 square, like in the King's Indian. And I think, although black's okay here, Moiseenko would have been able to use his knowledge of strategic chess and to get a totally reasonable position with white, where he has good control of the e4 square. So, although f5 is okay for black, I prefer the way that Antipov played this, with in going back to the game, without f5, we have knight h5. This is an exceptional move. I mean, this move is a move that looks like it loses time. It pulls the knight away from its aggressive position, but it's thinking ahead. It's keeping flexibility for black, keeping black's position flexible, putting the ball in white's court, and making white have to do the thinking. If you play f5, you make the position very easy for him to play. So it's like kudos to Antipov for making like difficult decisions for white here. Knight h5, and then finally white decides on a reasonable kind of mode of development, g3, when he could consider like the positional exchange bishop h3 of the white squared bishops at some point. And again, f5 is totally okay for Antipov. I mean, this would be an absolute 100% normal move to play, and the position is pretty much level, I think, similar to the last variation I showed. But Antipov creates more problems for white with the combative move c6. And c6 is a little bit less standard because black is attacking the head of the pawn chain. According to Nimzowitsch, we should attack the base of the pawn chain. I mean, there's no doubt that Nimzowicz's principles are correct, but sometimes in practice, life is more difficult if you do the less expected thing. And here, I looked, for example, at, I think c5. This is a very interesting continuation, for example, c5. Very complicated, but I'm not sure. If c5d takes c5, knight c4 I analyzed, and it's a really strange position with, I would say, chances for both sides. Very complicated. White's going to take this pawn on e5, but his king's in the center. It's opening up. It's not clear. I think c5 was a risky try, and white could have done it. Would have really made the position very, very messy. Instead here, white played bishop e2, and this is kind of a standard developing move, sort of indirectly hitting the knight on h5, knight f6, and Antipov really hasn't developed anything. I mean, he's just castled, played c6 and a5, and meanwhile white is creating all this play and all this weakness in his position with b3, a3, c4, d5, e4, g3, h4. He's moved literally every pawn on the board except for the f-pawn, which we know from classical chess is okay. I mean, in closed positions, Korchnoi did this. It looks like a Korchnoi game, really, honestly. Korchnoi did this all the time. But the practical difficulties of playing without castling can be seen. Here, maybe white should castle. It's totally a reasonable plan for white. I mean, it's sort of like now or never for castling for white. But instead he played this move, which I think was one of the more mysterious moves of the game. Again, you could even castle queenside if you want to be maniacal, but let's face it, folks, c6 I think is the reason why Antipov possibly played it, was to discourage white from castling queenside. In the Nimzo and in the King's Indian especially, this kind of move is often played strategically, but in this position I think it's more like trying to discourage white from castling queenside, because black can try to open up the position, open up the c file. So this discourages white from castling queenside. Now rook d1. I mean, strategically it makes some sense because the pawn on d6 could potentially be a weakness, but it's not easy to see where this knight on d2 is going, leaving the center, and white isn't castled. Rook d1 looks like kind of aggressive looking move. It's not really clear what it does in this exact position. So Antipov just develops with knight h6, knight a6, and then it gets a little bit weirder. This was the stage where I thought that Moiseenko just lost the thread of the position. Rook d1, although reasonable, it doesn't seem to have a clear plan, and then he goes really a little bit off with knight h2. Again, I think that it's time to decide something concrete about this position, what white's trying to do, because knight h2, maybe he wants to play g4, g5, just totally take over the position, and that is possible, and that is actually dangerous if black plays too routinely here. But black does not play routinely. He played c takes d5, when, as I mentioned earlier, it really looks like the c file could be dangerous. I still think white should take back with the c pawn, which is the normal positional recapture in the King's Indian. This sort of pawn structure, I should say. It doesn't matter what opening we're talking about. I mean, this central pawn structure where it's locked at e4 and e5 and d4 or d5, d6, it sort of dictates the play and the structure. And normally c takes d. White could use the c4 square for the pieces, especially the knight. And he was nervous, I guess, about the c file. But this is an unusual recapture. E takes d. And it looks more akin to like a Najdorf Sicilian or something like that. But the changing in the pawn structure really makes the position more dynamic, more double-edged, And I think that sort of benefits black here because white isn't castled. And if things start to open up, I mean, it's going to benefit black more than white because the white king is in the center. So now a very good move from Antipov. Bishop h3. If he plays hesitantly here, I think that Moiseenko might play g4, g5 and sort of take over the position. So bishop h3 was very appropriate. And this is a situation where it looks like black is better, but I'm not saying he's winning. Bishop h3, and then another slightly strange move, queen c3. It's a nice diagonal for the bishop and queen, and he's trying to kind of trap the bishop. It's almost like a cheapo, like he's threatening to trap the bishop with g4, and he's threatening the pawn on a5, although this pawn is defended at the moment. It's sort of like some sort of double attack, but you can see the pawn on e5 is black's strong point. So it's unlikely white's going to be able to break through on the long diagonal a1 to h8. Now Antipov played the whole game perfectly, very efficiently, I thought. And now queen d7, getting control of g4 and developing a piece. So although the queen obviously had some ideas of going to b6, as it might often in the Bogo, to attack this square, he wants to connect his rooks, maybe prepare rook c8, something like rook on f to c8 with the idea b5 looks very strong for black, and stop white from playing g4. So concretely stopping g4 and completing his development, basically. Black paying more attention to concretely developing, white making a weird series of moves, Moiseenko here, beginning with, you know, rook d1, knight h2, and now queen c3, just ignoring the fact that his king is center, and now rook g1. And this gives up any potential for white to castle on the king's side, so black is now in charge. Here he could play resolutely. I think that it's a scary move in a way to play, but I think the best move for black is probably h5. This really locks down the g4 square, and I think would have just reduced white's play to basically 0. So h5 is a little bit committal, a little bit scared, but I think it's a very strong move. Instead, he plays a good move, knight g4, and this move frees the f-pawn for movement. White is not well coordinated here, and black has basically finished his development, and he's ready to mobilize the rooks and open the position. So as in the Sicilian Najdorf, I mean, black may be ready to play f5 and activate along the f-file. This also could help, if he moves the f-pawn forward, he could defend g7 laterally. So knight to g4, I don't like really trading pieces per se, especially the knight on h2, but Antipov manages to both sort of stop white's plans and enable his own expansion with f5. Knight to g4, knight takes g4, bishop takes g4, and here the 26-67 Moiseenko, you know, he doesn't really want to trade pieces, and it's an attacking, spirited game. So he decides not to trade. He gets control of the center. I think f3 is okay. He doesn't want to have weaknesses. And he's obviously playing for a win. But now after bishop h5, keep in mind that the h4 pawn is hanging. So this is where Moiseenko kind of missed a chance to play very tactically. He could have played g4, sacrificing a pawn concretely. g4, bishop takes h4 check, king f1, finally a kind of home for the white king, and then the forced bishop g6. And what white has here is some kind of compensation for the sacrifice material. It's a little hard to find this because you have to see the mating threats along the long diagonal. It looks scary to sacrifice the h-pawn and then play f4 and totally open up the white king. But the way his pieces are set up, it actually makes some sense. For example, f6 is a very bad move for black. Though it looks solid, it would actually lose a piece. This bishop on h4 can be trapped by the white queen or the white rook. So f6 loses, for example. Black has to play something like h6, and white can win a pawn back with pawn takes pawn. So the position seems very, very double-edged. Knight f3 is huge here. If we take back on e5, white plays not queen takes pawn, but knight f3, threatening knight takes e5, and maybe g5 in some positions. So the position remains kind of complicated. I thought this was really Moiseenko's only chance in this position. In the game, he just starts going pawn grabbing, which is never a good thing when you're not coordinated and your king is still trapped in the center. So queen takes a5. This is kind of just crazy. I mean, a player who's lost the thread of the position completely, it can happen to anybody. But here it happened to a very strong player, Moiseenko, who was having an up and down tournament anyway. Queen takes a5. Obviously very dangerous to give black time here. But it's amazing how quickly this falls apart. Knight c5, queen back to c3. He snatches a pawn, comes back, and then f5. And suddenly black has pretty serious threats. I mean, f4 would undermine this pawn on h4. So that's a huge threat right there. f4 really has to be dealt with. Moiseenko plays rook h1 to defend the h4 pawn. And then another problem, bishop f6, which is extremely unpleasant for white. So you can see that if queen c2, bishop g6, not really possible because of h5. I guess this is the best continuation. When after queen c2, looks like black might play rook on a to e8. The knight also has the a4 square, keep in mind. So I don't know. It looks like black has very good compensation for material, and it's still a game. But Moiseenko here played a very bad move, queen e3, lining the queen up with the king and leaving the bishop on b2 unprotected. Very bad combination. Rook a e8, and now just oblivious to the danger, he plays b4. When obviously he expected black to play knight a4 and probably bishop a1, when the knight on a4 is not really in a good place, but he missed that black has this breakthrough e4 when the piece is hanging on b2. So suddenly white is lost. e4, f takes e4, and now the king, which was never developed, never castled, is punished for being in the center. Knight takes e4, and white is lost. White is just simply lost. The king, bishop, queen, all lined up on the same e line. Moiseenko's final blunder, queen e3, basically. And now he has to give up the queen, but it's not nearly enough material. Bishop takes h5, and I guess a little bit nervous here on the verge of a win against strong player. Antipov made a mistake. Much better to take on g3, discovering on the queen. He took on d2 in the game. If we take on g3, we've got a hit on the rook on h1, which makes this just a material wipeout. In the actual game, Antipov had to be careful because he played knight takes d2, which is winning, but not by as much of a margin. Bishop takes e8, rook takes e8, skewering the queen, and then a good try by Moiseenko, king takes d2. Almost has enough material here. He in fact has something like at the end, rook takes e3, bishop takes f6, virtually material equality with a rook, bishop, and a pawn for a queen, but loses this pawn, and it's not enough. Rook takes a3, bishop c3. Most importantly, the black queen and rook can coordinate here against the uncastled king. Rook a2 check, king d3, and then f4. Invasion on the white squares, and a very neat finish from Antipov. G takes f4, queen f5 check, king e3, and queen c2, double attacking the bishop, threatening mate along the 7th rank. Moiseenko continued one more move, king d4, then he decided to resign. And this is the end of the game, but it would have finished with a mate. I'm sure Antipov would have found it. Queen f2 check, king e4, now rook e2 check, and the king has to go up to avoid immediate mate on d3. He has to go king f5, and then g6 check would force mate, basically. It would be something like king g5, queen g3, king h6, and queen takes f4. Would have been the longest mate that Antipov would have had to actually produce there. So I thought this was a creative game that I really appreciate. I mean, I definitely play in a similar style to Antipov, a little bit hyper modern in the Bogo-Indian, trying to get my opponents to overextend. I thought this kind of unusual variation was an excellent example of how to get a strong player to kind of overreach themselves and do a little bit of bullfighting with the black pieces. So a great win by Antipov against the higher rated Moiseenko from the Aeroflot Open 2016. An interesting variation of the Bogo-Indian. If you don't know what to do against knight to d2, this setup isn't really that theoretical for black, so it might be something to investigate if you play the Bogo for black. I'm International Master William Paschall. Thanks for joining me here at my YouTube channel, Video Chess Training. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks again.